Every year, 2 million people flood into the streets of New Orleans. A man stands on a float and throws beads into a crowd of strangers. And somewhere on Bourbon Street, there's a woman lifting her shirt for a necklace that probably costs 12 cents to manufacture that she'll almost certainly throw away tomorrow. And somewhere in a kitchen, a family is cutting into a cake with a plastic baby inside, and whoever finds the baby wins. But here's the thing, nobody in that kitchen knows why there's a baby in the cake, and nobody asks. Mardi Gras, or Fat Tuesday, is the greatest free party on earth, or rather, that's what they call it. 2 million people flooding into a single city to drink, to dance, to put on masks and become someone they're not for a night. And when it's over, when Ash Wednesday comes, they'll wash the glitter off their face and pretend it never happened. But here's the thing about Mardi Gras. It was never a party. It started with a sacrifice in a cave. Priests smearing blood on the faces of young men. Naked bodies running through the street, whipping anyone in their path. Women lining up to be struck because they believed it would make them fertile. Then the church got involved and somehow made things worse. Then wealthy men in a city built on slavery turned it into something else entirely. Something that looked like a celebration but was designed from the very beginning as an instrument of power. The beads aren't a tradition. The masks aren't for fun. The colors were invented by one man in 1 year for one parade. And the party was a funeral. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Chapter 1, The Feast of Madness. Before Mardi Gras had a name, before it had a city, before it had even a single bead or a single float, it had blood. And to understand what this celebration actually is, we have to go back, not hundreds of years, but thousands.
On the 15th of February, in a city that had not yet become an empire, a group of young men gather at the mouth of a cave. The cave sits at the base of Palatine Hill in Rome. The Romans call it the Lupercalia. According to their mythology, this is the place where a she-wolf nursed the infant twins named Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome itself. It is this, in the Roman imagination, the womb from which their civilization was born. Inside the cave, a group of priests called the Luperci prepare for a ritual that even predates the city they serve. Some scholars believe it stretches back to the 6th century before Christ, while others believe it is older still, inherited from traditions so ancient that even the Romans could not trace their origin. The Luperci bring forward a male goat and a dog. They then slit the animals' throats at the altar. Blood pools all over the stone. The priests then select 2 young men from among them, typically in their 20s, from prominent families, and press the sacrificial knife to their foreheads, painting a line of animal blood across their skin. But then, before the blood has a chance to dry, another priest quickly wipes it away with a piece of wool that has been soaked in goat's milk. The 2 young men are then required to laugh. The ritual demands it. What follows next is the Lupercalian run. The priest cut the skin of the slaughtered goat into long, narrow strips. These strips are called februa, a word meaning instruments of purification. The same word, that which gives us the name of the month. February. The month itself is named after strips of dead goat skin used for whipping. The young men strip nearly naked. In some accounts, they say that they wear only loincloths of goat hide, while others say they wear nothing at all. They take the februar in their fists and run from the cave out into the streets of Rome, and they run in a wide circuit around Palatine Hill, striking anyone in their path. Specifically, they strike women, and the women do not run, they do not hide. They line the route, they extend their hands. They step into the path of the runners deliberately because they believe that being struck with the februar will make them fertile, that the blood-soaked strips of a sacrificed goat carries a sacred power that will help them conceive, that will ease the pain of childbirth, that will purify their bodies for the creation of new life. This is not metaphorical. This is not symbolic in the way modern historians sometimes sanitize ancient practices. Roman women, including women of noble birth, women married to senators and magistrates, lined up in the streets and allowed themselves to be whipped with strips of dead animals because their civilization told them that this was how fertility worked. This festival lasted for over 1,000 years. Lupercalia was a purification rite, and that is what the Romans understood it to be. The blood, the nudity, the striking, all of it was meant to cleanse the city, to drive out evil spirits, to ensure that Rome would be healthy, fertile, and protected for another year. The goat represented fertility, the dog represented protection, the blood represented sacrifice. The laughter of the anointed young men represented the joy of renewal, and every element served a function. But the Lupercalia was not the only ancestor of the celebration we now call Mardi Gras. Running alongside it in the Roman calendar was another festival, one that pushed the boundaries of social order even further. It was called Saturnalia. Held in December, Saturnalia honored Saturn, the god of agriculture, time, and dissolution. For the duration of the festival, originally one day, then eventually expanded to nearly a week, the normal rules of Roman society were suspended, inverted, turned inside out. Slaves sat at their masters' tables and were served food by the people who owned them. Masters waited on their slaves. Social hierarchies that were enforced with violence for the other 359 days of the year simply ceased to exist. Citizens wore informal clothing instead of their togas. Gambling, which was normally illegal, was permitted openly. A mock king, the Saturnalicious Princeps, the Lord of Misrule, was elected by drawing lots. A bean was hidden inside a cake. Whoever found the bean became the king of the feast, and their absurd commands had to be obeyed. A bean inside a cake. A mock king chosen by chance. Commands that must be followed. If that sounds familiar, it should. The king cake you eat during Mardi Gras, the one with the plastic baby hidden inside, where whoever finds it has to buy the next cake or host the next party, is a direct descendant of this ritual. The baby has replaced the bean, but the obligation remained. The tradition is over 2,000 years old, but almost nobody who participates in it knows where it came from. And then there was Bacchus, Dionysus to the Greeks, Bacchus to the Romans, or better known as the god of wine, ecstasy, ritual madness, and the dissolution of the self. His cult was ancient and widespread, and his festivals, the Bacchanalia, were notorious even by Roman standards. The Bacchanalia were initiatory rites. They began as women-only ceremonies held 3 times a year. But over time they expanded. Men were admitted. The frequency increased. The rituals intensified. And what happened inside those rituals became the subject of one of the most dramatic political crackdowns in Roman history. In 186 BC, The Roman Senate launched an investigation into the Bacchanalia following testimony from a young man named Publius Abutius and a freedwoman named Hispala Faecinia. According to the historian Livy, Hispala told the Senate that the rites had become something unrecognizable, that initiates were subjected to sexual violence, that those who resisted were killed, and that the screaming of the victims was drowned out by drums and cymbals that were played deliberately to mask the sound. The Senate's response was swift and severe. The Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus of 186 BC effectively banned the Bacchanalia across the Italian peninsula. Thousands of people were arrested, hundreds were executed, and the cult was driven underground. But it was never truly destroyed. The worship of Bacchus continued in private, in modified forms, in whispered ceremonies that persisted for centuries. The ecstatic dissolution of Bacchus, the masks, the wine, the temporary abandonment of identity would resurface again and again throughout European history. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived the rise of Christianity, and it found its fullest modern expression in a single word that carries all of this history inside it, whether the people who use it know it or not: carnival. In medieval Europe, the pagan echoes of Saturnalia and the Bacchanalia took on a new form. It was called the Feast of Fools. Held in late December or early January, the Feast of Fools was, on its surface, a celebration organized by the lower clergy of the Catholic Church. Subdeacons, deacons, and minor functionaries who spent the entire year in submission to their superiors were given, for one day, permission to rule. They elected a mock bishop, sometimes a mock pope. They wore their vestments inside out or dressed in the clothing of women. They then brought donkeys into the church and seated them near the altar. They rolled dice on the consecrated table. They burned old shoes in the censers instead of incense, filling the cathedral with the stench of scorched leather. They sang bawdy songs where hymns should have been. They ate sausages during the service. They mocked every sacred thing the church held dear, and they did it inside the church itself. The parallels to Saturnalia were not subtle: the inversion of hierarchy, the mock ruler, the temporary suspension of all rules. The church knew exactly what this was. It was the old pagan festival, dressed in Christian clothing, refusing to die. And for centuries, the church tried to kill it. The Council of Basel banned the Feast of Fools in 1431. Local bishops issued prohibitions throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. But the feast kept coming back. The lower clergy needed it. The common people needed it. The pressure valve of controlled chaos was, it seemed, a fundamental human requirement that no decree could eliminate. The church's eventual solution was not to destroy the impulse. It was to contain it, to manage it, to channel the chaos into a specific, bounded period of the calendar where excess would be permitted, even encouraged, because what followed would be penance. They called it carnival, and it would become the most elaborate system of engineered guilt in the history of organized religion.
Chapter 2: Farewell to the Flesh. The name carnival sounds like a celebration. It sounds like joy. It sounds like freedom. But when you learn what the word actually means, you realize it was never any of those things.
The word carnival comes from the Latin Carne, carne meaning flesh, levare meaning to remove, to lift away, to take. Carnival literally means the removal of flesh. Some scholars translate it as farewell to the flesh, while others render it more literally, the stripping away of meat. Either way, both translations point to the same truth. Carnival was never meant to be a beginning. It was always an ending, a last meal, a final indulgence before the door closed and the deprivation began. The logic of the church was precise and, in its own way, brilliant. Christianity could not destroy the pagan impulse toward excess. Centuries of bans, decrees, and condemnations had proven that. People wanted their festival. They wanted their chaos. They wanted their one period of the year where the rules did not apply. So the church had two options: either continue to fight a battle it was losing, or absorb the impulse and redirect it. It chose absorption. The church created a calendar that worked like a machine. Carnival, the season of excess, would begin on 12th night, the last day of Christmas, and build toward its climax on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. During this period, Christians were permitted to feast, to drink, to dance, to wear masks, to indulge the appetites of the body. The church did not merely tolerate this, it sanctioned it, and in some regions, it organized it. Then, on Ash Wednesday, everything stopped and Lent began. Its 40 days of fasting, prayer, and penance. No meat, no rich foods, no celebrations, no indulgence of any kind. The faithful were expected to spend 6 weeks in austerity, examining their sins and preparing their souls for Easter. The genius of this system was not just the permission, it was the sequence. By allowing the excess to happen first, the church had ensured that the faithful would feel the weight of their own behavior when the fasting began. You did not merely give up meat for Lent, you gave up meat after weeks of gorging on it. You did not merely pray for forgiveness, you prayed for forgiveness after weeks of doing the very things you now needed to be forgiven for. The sin and the penance were packaged together and sold as a single unit, and the church positioned itself as the only institution that could complete the transaction. The party that existed to make the punishment feel deserved. The most visible symbol of this cycle was the bœuf gras, also known as the fatted calf. In Paris and other European cities, butchers competed to raise the largest, most magnificent ox. The winning animal was then paraded through the streets in a grand procession, decorated with garlands and ribbons, and cheered by crowds who understood exactly what was about to happen. At the end of the procession, the ox was slaughtered. It was the last meat that would be consumed before Lent. The feast that followed was both a celebration and a funeral, a farewell to the pleasures of the body. This is where the name comes from. Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, in French. Mardi, Tuesday, Gras, fat. The day of the fatted animal. The day of the last feast. The day before everything is taken away. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII formalized the relationship between Carnival and the liturgical calendar when he introduced the Gregorian calendar, the same calendar the world still uses today. Mardi Gras was locked into its position, always falling 47 days before Easter, always on a Tuesday, always serving as the final act before the curtain of Lent descended. The date is not arbitrary, and the distance is not accidental. The 40 days of Lent mirrors the 40 days Christ spent fasting in the desert and resisting the temptations of Satan. The implication is clear. You are Christ in the desert. Your carnival was your temptation. Your Lent is your atonement. And the church is the voice that guides you through both. This was the framework that European colonists carried with them when they crossed the Atlantic. The pagan blood ritual had been absorbed into a Christian calendar. The Saturnalian chaos had been contained within a bounded season. The Bacchic dissolution had been channeled into a period of permitted excess that the church could point to afterward as evidence of the faithful's need for salvation. By the time Carnival reached the shores of the New World, it had been through over 2,000 years of transformation. But the essential mechanism of it had never changed. It was still a ritual of sacrifice, still a farewell to the flesh, still a system where pleasure was permitted only because punishment was guaranteed to follow. Now, the only thing missing was a city desperate enough and divided enough to turn it into something the world had never seen.
Chapter 3. The Men Behind the Masks. Everything I've told you so far, the blood, the whipping, the engineered guilt, that's ancient history. But what happened next is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Because the men who built modern Mardi Gras didn't just throw a party, they built a machine. And that machine was designed to do one thing.
By the 1850s, Mardi Gras in New Orleans was dying. The celebration had arrived with French settlers in the early 18th century. The first recorded observance in the Louisiana Territory dates to 1699, when the French-Canadian explorer called Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville camped along the Mississippi River on Fat Tuesday and marked the occasion with a small celebration. He named his campsite Pointe du Mardi Gras. Over the following decades, as New Orleans grew from a colonial outpost into a thriving port city, the traditions of masking, street parades, and lavish balls took root. But by the 1850s, the celebrations had become dangerous. The streets on Mardi Gras were overrun with drunkenness and violence. Masked gangs roamed freely, using the anonymity of costume as cover for assault, robbery, and worse. Respectable families stayed inside. The city's newspapers warned that the tradition was collapsing into lawlessness. Local officials considered banning public celebrations altogether. In 1857, a group of men decided to save Mardi Gras. They called themselves the Mystic Crew of Comus. The word crew was their invention, an archaic spelling of crew, which is meant to evoke medieval mystery and aristocratic tradition. Everything about Comus was designed to project power. Their first parade, on the night of Mardi Gras 1857, featured torchlit floats, marching bands, and a theme drawn from Milton's Paradise Lost, the demons of hell parading through the streets of New Orleans. It was spectacular, it was sophisticated, and it was, from its inception, an instrument of white supremacy. The founding members of Comus were wealthy white men. Many were of Anglo-American descent, part of the English-speaking elite that had taken control of New Orleans after the Louisiana Purchase. Others were from the city's old-line Creole aristocracy, and nearly all shared two things in common. They were rich, and they would, within 4 years, fight for the Confederacy. Comus did not merely organize a parade, it organized a social hierarchy. Membership was by invitation only. The invitation came only to white men of the right class, the right family, the right politics. The Crewe held an annual ball after the parade, a private, invitation-only affair where the city's elite gathered behind closed doors to drink, to dance, and to reinforce the bonds that kept them in power. More crews followed. Rex was founded in 1872, Momus in 1872 as well, Proteus in 1882. Each was organized along the same lines: wealthy, white, male, exclusive. Each held its own parade and its own ball. Each functioned not just as a carnival organization, but as a social club, a business network, and a political machine. And in the years after the Civil War, these crews did something that reveals exactly what Mardi Gras was built to do. In 1873, the crew of Comus chose a parade theme that left no ambiguity about its purpose. The theme was the missing links to Darwin's Origin of Species. The floats depicted humanized gorillas. The costumes were designed with the exaggerated features of minstrel show caricatures: oversized lips, wide eyes, dark skin. The message was not subtle, and it was not intended to be. The 14th and 15th Amendments had just been ratified, granting citizenship and voting rights to Black Americans. Reconstruction was underway. Black men were serving in the Louisiana state legislature for the first time in history. Comus's response was to parade through the streets of New Orleans depicting black people as animals. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The old line crews used Mardi Gras as a stage for political theatre. Their parades satirized Reconstruction. Their floats mocked Republican politicians. Their imagery reinforced the racial hierarchy that the war had supposedly ended. And because the parades were public spectacles, witnessed by tens of thousands, the message reached further than any newspaper editorial or political speech ever could. Then in 1875, Mardi Gras was cancelled entirely. Not because of the weather, not because of a plague, because the political violence between white supremacists and Republicans had become so severe that the city could not guarantee public safety. White paramilitary groups had been attacking black voters and Republican office holders throughout Louisiana. Several of the men involved in that violence were members of the old line crews. When Mardi Gras returned, the crews returned with it, and they carried their politics with them. The masks were part of it. Masking during Carnival has ancient roots. The Romans wore masks during Saturnalia, the Venetians made it the centerpiece of their carnival, and the tradition crossed the Atlantic with European settlers. But in New Orleans, masking took on a specific racial function. As early as 1781, when the city was under Spanish colonial rule, black residents were banned from wearing masks during Carnival. The stated reason was that masks allowed black people to sneak into white celebrations undetected. The real reason was simpler. Masks erase identity, and identity was the foundation on which the racial hierarchy was built. A masked black man at a white ball was a threat not because he might cause harm, but because his presence, undetected, proved that the boundary between the races was permeable, that it could be crossed, that the categories were not as fixed as the people in power needed them to be. The mask bans went in and out of effect for over a century. Even today, wearing masks in New Orleans is technically illegal for most of the year. The exception is Carnival, and if you are riding on a Mardi Gras float, the law requires you to wear one. The instrument of racial policing became, over time, a mandatory element of the celebration. The history was buried, the tradition remained, And the most damning part of this history is how long it lasted. The crews remained legally segregated, not informally, not by custom, but by their own official policies, until 1991. That year, Dorothy Mae Taylor, the first black woman on the New Orleans City Council, proposed an ordinance that would deny parade permits to any crew that discriminated on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, or national origin. The response was immediate. Taylor received death threats. She was accused of trying to destroy Mardi Gras. The business community, the crews, and the mayor pressured the city council to weaken the ordinance. When the final version passed, the penalties had been softened. The burden of proving discrimination had been shifted onto the victim rather than the club. And Taylor, the woman who wrote it, cast the only vote against it because it had been so diluted that she no longer recognized her own legislation. The mystic crew of Comus, the organization that had built modern Mardi Gras in 1857, chose to stop parading rather than admit black members. The Knights of Momus made the same choice. They would rather end their own tradition than share it. Comus has never returned to the streets. Their final act was to choose segregation over celebration, and in doing so, they revealed what the celebration had always been about.
Chapter 4: The Other Mardi Gras. Over 100 years, black people in New Orleans were told that Mardi Gras wasn't for them. The parades weren't for them. The crews weren't for them. The masks were literally built, banned for them. So they built their own. And what they created might be the most extraordinary cultural response to exclusion in American history.
In 1909, a group of black men in New Orleans who belonged to a benevolent aid society, one of the few financial safety nets available to African Americans in the Jim Crow South, decided to form their own crew. They called themselves the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club. From the beginning, Zulu was an act of defiance disguised as celebration. Inspired by a stage production about Zulu warriors, the crew adopted a name that connected them not to European mythology, not to Comus, not to Rex, not to the Greek and Roman gods that the white crews claimed as their own, but to Africa, to a warrior tradition, to a lineage that the crews of Bourbon Street had spent a century trying to erase. But Zulu's defiance went deeper than the name. The crew's early members wore grass skirts, black face paint, and bushy wigs. They carried spears made of broomsticks. Their throws, the objects tossed from floats to the crowd, were hand-decorated coconuts rather than manufactured beads. This was satire. Zulu was holding a mirror up to white New Orleans and showing them what their racism looked like. The grass skirts mocked the primitive savage stereotypes that white supremacists used to justify segregation. The blackface, which would rightfully become controversial in later decades, was, in its original context, a parodic exaggeration of the minstrel show imagery that white Americans had been using to dehumanize black people for generations. Zulu took the caricature and wore it as armor. The coconuts became legendary, decorated, hand-painted, personal. Each one was a work of art that the crew member had crafted themselves. To catch a Zulu coconut was, and still is, considered one of the most prized experiences of Mardi Gras, where the white crews threw mass-produced trinkets from positions of elevation, Zulu's members created something with their hands and gave it away. The economics of the gesture were inverted. The meaning was transformed. But Zulu was not the only black response to exclusion. In the same neighborhoods where the white crews never paraded, another tradition was taking shape, one that would become perhaps the most visually stunning and culturally significant element of Mardi Gras, the Mardi Gras Indians. These were not crews in the traditional sense. They did not have floats or parade permits or corporate sponsors. They were neighborhood-based groups, called tribes or gangs, of African Americans who created elaborate costumes inspired by Native American regalia and paraded through their own communities on Mardi Gras Day. The tradition is rooted in a history of solidarity between black and indigenous communities in the American South. When enslaved people escaped, it was often Native American communities who sheltered them, hid them, integrated them. The Mardi Gras Indians named their tribes after the people who had helped their ancestors survive. Every suit, every feather, every bead was a tribute to that alliance. The suits take a full year to create. Each one is sewn entirely by hand. The big chief, the leader of each tribe, designs and constructs a suit that can weigh over 100 pounds and cost thousands of dollars in materials. Beads are stitched individually. Feathers are selected and arranged with meticulous precision. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, and when it is finished, the suit is worn once. On Mardi Gras Day, the big chief walks out of his home and into the streets, and the neighborhood gathers around him, and they parade. For decades, this was a dangerous thing to do. When two Mardi Gras Indian tribes crossed paths in the streets, the encounter could turn violent. Mardi Gras Day was sometimes used to settle scores between rival neighborhoods. The masks and costumes provided anonymity. The chaos of the celebration provided cover. Mothers prayed before their children went out. People were hurt. People died. The beautiful suits became, in some years, a kind of war dress. Over time, the violence subsided. The encounters between tribes became ritualized competitions, a battle of craftsmanship, song, and dance rather than fists. When two big chiefs meet today, they compare their suits, they chant, they challenge each other with movement and presence. The one with the most spectacular suit, the most commanding presence, the most powerful song, that chief wins. The fight became art. But the memory of what it used to be is carried in the ritual. There is one more tradition that emerged from the margins of Mardi Gras, and it is the one that most directly reveals what the celebration demanded of the people it excluded: the baby dolls. In the early 20th century, in the Storyville red light district of New Orleans, African-American sex workers adopted a carnival tradition of their own. They dressed as adult-sized baby dolls, satin bloomers, lace bonnets, rouged cheeks, exaggerated bows, and paraded through the streets during carnival season. The costume was advertising. The parade was a business strategy. In a city that permitted their labor but excluded them from its celebrations, the women of Storyville used Mardi Gras as a marketing opportunity. The baby doll costume was provocative by design. The juxtaposition of infantile clothing on adult bodies was meant to attract attention, to draw clients, to generate income during the busiest week of the year. Today, the baby dolls still parade. The tradition has been reclaimed as a celebration of black femininity, joy, and resilience. The costumes are more elaborate, the context is different, and the women who wear them do so out of cultural pride rather than economic necessity. But the origin sits underneath. the way all origins sit underneath in New Orleans, present, uncomfortable, and rarely discussed. Every one of these traditions, the Zulu crew, the Mardi Gras Indians, the baby dolls, exists because the official version of Mardi Gras was built on exclusion. They are not additions to the celebration, they are responses to it. They are what happens when a culture tells a community that the party is not for them, and the community responds by building a better one.
Chapter 5. The things you didn't know you were celebrating. So now you know the history, now you know what's underneath the parade. But here's the part that's going to stay with you, because every single thing you associate with Mardi Gras, every bead, every mask, every slice of cake, every color, traces back to something you were never told about. Let me show you.
Let's start with the beads. In 1872, a new crew called Rex organized the first daytime Mardi Gras parade. Rex was created specifically to honor a visiting dignitary, Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich of Russia, who had come to New Orleans reportedly in pursuit of an actress named Lydia Thompson. To welcome the Russian Duke, Rex elected a king to rule over Mardi Gras for the day, and that king, riding his float through the streets of New Orleans, threw glass beads and trinkets to the crowd below. The gesture was not generous. It was an imitation of royalty. A king on a throne, tossing tokens to his subjects. The crowd below, reaching upward, scrambling, competing for scraps of glass that had no value beyond the moment of their catching. The entire dynamic was designed to reinforce a hierarchy, those above, those below, and the transaction of worthless objects between them. By the 1920s, bead throwing had become a standard feature of Mardi Gras parades. By the 1980s, the tradition had mutated into something else entirely. The exchange of beads for exposure, the practice of women baring their bodies in exchange for plastic necklaces manufactured for fractions of a penny, became synonymous with Bourbon Street during carnival. Trace the line. A pagan fertility ritual in which women stood in the streets and allowed themselves to be whipped with goat hide in exchange for the promise of conception. A Roman festival in which social order was temporarily inverted and all rules were suspended. A mock king throwing trinkets to his subjects. And now, on Bourbon Street, a woman lifting her shirt for a string of plastic beads she will throw away in the morning. The surface changes. The structure does not. The powerful give worthless things to the less powerful, and both sides agree to pretend the transaction has meaning. Now the masks. People wear masks at Mardi Gras because masks are fun. That is the modern understanding, and it is almost entirely wrong. Masks during Saturnalia served a specific purpose. They erased identity so that slaves could eat beside masters and no one would know who was who. The mask was a technology of social inversion. It allowed the hierarchy to be suspended without anyone losing face, literally. In Venice, carnival masks became instruments of anonymity that enabled behavior the wearers could never engage in publicly. Affairs, intrigues, political conspiracies, all conducted behind masks that the city's laws protected. You could not, under Venetian law, unmask a masked citizen during carnival. In New Orleans, as we have seen, masks were tools of racial control. Black people were banned from wearing them because masks threatened the visible racial hierarchy. White people were required to wear them on floats because masks protected the anonymity of the crew members, men who were, in many cases, business leaders, politicians, and power brokers who did not want their public identities associated with the excesses of carnival. The mask has never been about fun. It has always been about power. Who has the right to hide? Who is forced to be seen? And what can be done in the space between the face and the disguise? Now, the king cake. A ring-shaped pastry covered in icing of purple, green, and gold, with a small plastic baby hidden inside. Whoever finds the baby is obligated to buy the next cake, or host the next party, or bring the next round. It is, on its surface, a harmless game. The plastic baby replaced a dried bean. The bean was a Roman tradition from Saturnalia, where it was hidden inside a cake to select the Saturnalicious princeps, the lord of misrule, the mock king who would preside over the chaos. Finding the bean meant you were chosen by fate to rule. Your commands, no matter how absurd, had to be obeyed for the duration of the festival. When Christianity absorbed Saturnalia, the bean was reinterpreted. In France, it became part of the celebration of Epiphany, the arrival of the Magi, the three kings who visited the infant Jesus. The bean was replaced in some traditions with a tiny figure of the baby Jesus. Finding it in your slice of cake symbolized the Magi's discovery of Christ's divinity. So when you bite into a king cake and find a plastic baby, you are participating in a tradition that began as a Roman game of chance to select a ruler over chaos, was absorbed by the church as a reenactment of the discovery of a divine child, and survives today as an obligation to buy pastry for your co-workers. Every layer of meaning has been stripped away except the obligation. The bean became a baby. The fate of a king became a trip to the bakery. And no one at the office party knows they are performing a ritual that is over 2,000 years old. And finally, the colors: purple, green, and gold. The unmistakable palette of Mardi Gras. If you ask someone what they mean, they will tell you: purple for justice, green for faith, gold for power. Those meanings were assigned retroactively. Nobody knows exactly where the colors came from. What is known is that Rex, the crew founded in 1872 to honor the Russian Grand Duke, selected purple, green, and gold as their official colors for that year's parade. Some historians believe the colors were chosen because they were the house colors of the visiting duke. Others believe they were simply available in the quantities needed to decorate the parade route. Rex then assigned the meanings: justice, faith, and power, and the association stuck. The entire color scheme of one of the world's most recognizable festivals was invented in a single year by a single organization for a single parade, possibly to impress a Russian aristocrat who was chasing an actress. It is not ancient. It is not sacred. It is not symbolic in any meaningful historical sense. It is a branding decision made by a group of wealthy men in 1872 that became, through repetition and time, something that feels like it has always existed. That is the trick of tradition. Do something long enough and people forget it was invented. Do it with enough spectacle and people assume it must be meaningful. Wrap it in masks and music and color and alcohol, and people stop asking questions entirely.
So that's Mardi Gras, a blood ritual in a Roman cave that became a whipping ceremony, that became a medieval feast of madness, that became a tool of the Catholic Church, that became a weapon of white supremacy, that became the greatest free party on earth. 2 million people, plastic beads, king cake, purple, green, and gold. None of it is what you thought it was. The beads are a mock king's trinkets, thrown down to the subjects who scramble for scraps. The masks are instruments of power and racial control that were banned for black people and required for white people. The king cake carries a 2,000-year-old Roman game inside it. The colours were invented in 1872 to impress a foreign duke, and the name itself, carnival, means farewell to the flesh, a funeral for pleasure, organised by an institution that would sell you the sin and the cure in the same transaction. But here's what I keep coming back to. The people who were excluded from Mardi Gras, the ones who were told the masks weren't for them, the parades weren't for them, the celebration wasn't for them. They didn't disappear. They built the Zulu crew, they built the Mardi Gras Indians, they built traditions so extraordinary that they became the most authentic, the most human, the most beautiful parts of the entire celebration, while the old line crews were choosing segregation over inclusion. The communities they excluded were creating art that would outlast every float Comus ever built. The party was a funeral, but the people who weren't invited to the funeral built something that was actually alive. If this changed the way you see Mardi Gras, subscribe to the Midnight Archives. We illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.